In 1830, cholera was sweeping Canada, and then it ended up here in Quebec City. Now, there was a lady who lived in the city, a very prominent citizen, and her name was Mrs. Iris Dillon. Mrs. Dillon had two fears in her life, and one was the fear of catching cholera. She barricaded herself in her house, and she refused to see anyone until the epidemic was over. Because if you know anything about cholera, you know that it is so deadly that you could literally die within hours of catching it. Well, on one weekend, Mrs. Dillon's husband, Mr. Dillon, had to leave to Montreal to go on a business trip for a few days. So he kissed his wife goodbye, said he loved her, and he went on his way. Well, when he returned a few days later, instead of his wife waiting on the porch to greet him, instead he was greeted by the sorrowful neighbors who began to express their grief over the death of his wife from cholera. "But that is impossible," said Mr. Dillon. "My wife, she never saw anyone. She barricaded herself into this room. She refused to see anyone. How could this be?" Well, the situation was so bad at the time that bodies were literally thrown into the closest holes to try and stop the spread of this disease. And this had been the case with Mrs. Dillon. And when the neighbors brought Mr. Dillon to the location where they had buried her, he got on his hands and knees and quickly dug up the body of his wife, only to realize that she had not died from cholera, but rather from fright. You see, the other fear that Mrs. Dillon had was the fear of being buried alive. She suffered from a condition that we now know as narcolepsy, a condition that can cause someone to fall into a very deep sleep that resembles death. And knowing her condition, Mrs. Dillon stayed inside when she felt a narcoleptic spell coming on. Well, when her husband was away, the neighbors went to check on her, and they had found her lifeless on the floor and had accidentally diagnosed her as dying from cholera, and they had buried her alive. So, we believe that it might indeed be the ghost of a benevolent woman who is trying to watch over the souls who pass through these doors and making sure that those who enter here do not have the same fate bestowed upon them as being buried alive as she.